most of the night is going to be dedicated to the doctors, Norgaard, speaking about the topic at hand. Is there anybody in here would like a brief overview of what the pipeline is going to be? Most people are pretty familiar with it, so I would think I could bypass going over that. And what fracking is, I don't know if people need to understand what fracked gas is compared to normal gas. Is there anybody with a little explanation, or are we all good? Because it does help to understand what you're dealing with. The compressor station for the Northeast Energy Direct Pipeline is slated to be built basically right beyond Mark's cattle farm, right over to our east here. As far as I can tell, George Stoltz was here, he'd be able to tell more specifically, but I think on a clear day we could probably see the stacks from here if we were just went outside. It's going to be that close, within a half a mile, and the stacks are pretty high. We're here tonight because we want to, a lot of things what we've heard about the compressor stations and fracked gas compressor stations. I know myself, I've seen a report from the Southwest Pennsylvania Environmental Health Project, and a lot of you are familiar with reports about Minisync, New York compressor station, and the health effects there. So what we have tonight is Dr. Curtis Norgaard. He's a senior resident pediatrician at the Boston Children's Hospital and Boston Medical Center. He is the co-founder and member of Just Health Network, which supports grassroots health and wellness projects around the globe. But that's not why we have him here tonight. We have him here because he has an interest in environmental health, and in particular climate change and asthma, two environmental health problems facing many of today's children. The proposal of this new gas, or numerous new gas pipeline projects in New England, challenged him to explore their potential health impacts. I mean, the infrastructure is just increasing all over the Northeast. He's particularly been focused on the health impacts from compressor stations in affected communities in the Northeast. The natural gas compressor stations burn methane, as we know, emit a mixture of volatile organic compounds. In general, these pollutants have been linked to heart disease, respiratory diseases, low birth weight, and preterm births. His talk is going to address data known about how air pollutants and are distributed from compressor stations, what kind of pollutants are released, what the health consequences to us, because if there's any consequences, we are going to be feeling them. For local residents and where these facilities are located, what communities facing natural gas infrastructure development can do to prepare themselves. This is all great information. Dr. Norgaard has done similar talks in Northfield and in Windsor, Massachusetts. He's actually has talked with the governor, with members of the Municipal Pipeline Coalition. So, without further ado, Dr. Curtis Norgaard.
Thank you very much for the great introduction. And I'd like to thank everybody for coming out on a weeknight. It's not easy for anybody. We're all busy. And we all have other things we'd rather be doing than talking about this pipeline, but it's not our choice, but we have to address this. And the only thing I'll say is that I did finish my training, and I'm working at a community health center in Boston right now, which has enabled me to continue spending time working on the issues that we heard about in the introduction. I do have, along with my medical training, I do have a research background, and I've used that background to understand not only the regulatory documents that have been filed in relation to the pipeline, but also the public health research that's been done related to air pollution in general, and tried to use my background to understand that information about air pollution might be relevant for compressor stations. And then I'll make some brief references to data that myself and other people have been collecting regarding compressor stations. So these are the questions that I hope we can address tonight. First of all, what is it that compressor stations emit in terms of pollutants? Just to make sure we're all on the same page with that. And then answer the question, are those emissions harmful? And after that, do people living near compressor stations experience negative health effects? And really the most important question for tonight, is it possible that emissions coming from a compressor station, if one were built in New Ipswich, would be harmful to human health? And all of the conversation up to that point will be regarding the direct health effects of air pollution. But there are also indirect effects, and if we have time, I'd also like to mention a couple of things about the use of fracked gas as a clean bridge fuel, which a lot of people have been talking about for years now. And so, as we heard, I expect most people here are familiar with compressor stations, but if you haven't been to a lot of meetings, haven't heard a lot, I just wanted to show a couple of slides about them. And is the view okay, or should we bring the lights down a little bit?
Please.
Okay. So compressor stations are really complexes that are built right alongside regional fracked gas pipelines. It might be too much. That should be good. Thank you. And really, they really are complexes. So the most prominent part of the complex is this building that houses the engine. And this is a picture of a compressor station in Pennsylvania. We call it 6,700 horsepower. That just refers to the size of the engine inside of this building. But don't overlook the fact that there are other things at the complex. There's tanks, there are pipelines, and that's because the gas needs to be processed before it's burned in the compressor engine. And things like water and impurities need to be removed, and in fact, sometimes toxins end up being purified in these storage tanks. Emergency backup generator fuels need to be stored on site. Sometimes there are pipeline cleaning facilities co-located at compressor stations, and those can also be a source of toxic pollution. But really, for reasons that I think will become clear, I want to focus tonight on the air pollution coming from the compressor engines themselves. And it's not that those other sources of pollution are not important, but the most significant discussion, I think, has to do with those emissions. So 6,700 horsepower, I think probably most people here realize that's a lot smaller than what Kinder Morgan would like to build in New Ipswich. So I have this picture of a larger compressor station. It's still a lot smaller. It's not even half the size of what Kinder Morgan would like to build, but you can see it looks a little bit bigger. And notice now all the extra pipelines here, the storage tanks. And then the same station with a broader aerial view, with the house in the background to give you some idea of perspective. And so if we say Kinder Morgan's would be roughly twice this size, then we're starting to get some sense of how big this thing would be. Okay, and then just a view inside what these engines actually look like. Okay, so now back to our first question. What is it that comes out of the compressor engine? And these are data from Kinder Morgan's most recent filing. This is from their final application to the federal government. They put in estimates of how much air pollution the compressor station in Ipswich would release if it were built. And I'm using this as the starting point for a lot of discussion in the talk. And I've heard people bring up the fact that, well, can we really trust these data? These are the data the company is producing, and they're coming from the company themselves. And we might look at things like nitrogen oxides. Total emissions per year, 49.62 tons. And elsewhere in their application, well, they conveniently point out that, well, we fortunately come in just under the 50 tons per year threshold that would require us to meet additional regulatory filing requirements. So there are things like that which might make us say, well, do we really trust these numbers? And I don't disagree with that. But what we can do is use these as a starting point, evaluate these numbers, and ask, well, if you're admitting this is what you're going to be releasing in our communities, are there any health implications from what you're telling us that you would do? So again, as a starting point, we have, this is just a list of the toxic emissions, and I'm calling them toxic emissions because literally these are all well-established toxic air pollutants. That's why they have to be listed here. They're regulated for the most part by the EPA as well as by states. Nitrogen oxides, carbon monoxide, volatile organic compounds, particulate matter, sulfur dioxide, hazardous air pollutants, and formaldehyde as one of the largest component of this hazardous air pollutant. And I highlighted these two in particular because from my evaluation of Kinder Morgan's documents and what I know about air pollution and human health, these are the two out of this list that are most relevant for Nugget switch. And I'm going to come back and talk about these in great detail. But first I want to talk generally and just make the point that everything in that list is toxic. And these are data that I'm going to show from these studies. These are just a number of public health studies. There are literally thousands of studies like these, so I'm just putting up a few to make the point that in general, these pollutants are toxic. Nitrogen dioxide has been associated with increased respiratory hospitalizations, heart failure, carbon monoxide, increased birth weight, premature birth rates, low birth weight, sulfur dioxide, low birth weight, heart failure, particulate matter, increased fatality from heart and lung disease, and new childhood asthma diagnoses. And the numbers in parentheses are the percent change in health outcome for a particular unit of change for the pollutant. So again, I'm not saying this is what would happen here, but making the general point and giving us some general sense that we can do more than simply list health conditions. We can actually get numbers from published data. And we'll make good use of that later. So then we can ask, well, I'm saying these are all toxic. You would expect people living near compressor stations might have some health symptoms from that. These are data from a study where the investigators went to people living near fracked gas infrastructure. So that includes fracking wells, fracking wastewater storage ponds, and compressor stations. So it's really a mixture of those things. These are data from Pennsylvania, but I think a reasonable starting point. And what you can see is, for just these few symptoms that I pulled out of this study, the people who live closer than 500 feet clearly are reporting these symptoms more frequently than people who live further away, greater than 1,500 feet. 74, 76%. And the farther away you go, as one would expect, the fewer symptoms. There's another group that we already heard reference to, and people here in Hampshire are making good use of this information related to a compressor station that was built in 2013, I believe, in Minnesota, New York. So, of course, fracking is banned in New York State, so there are no fracking wells or any other infrastructure. It's mostly just compressor stations and pipelines. And what these investigators did from this group is they did a similar study where they interviewed people and just asked them to report health symptoms. And they interviewed 35 residents who lived within about a mile of a compressor station. And again, as you may be aware, the one in New York is 12,000 horsepower, significantly smaller than what would be built here. But of course, there was a high frequency of symptoms reported. Respiratory symptoms and nosebleeds, 22 out of 35 people living within a mile of the station reported those symptoms. 12 out of 35 headaches, 10 out of 35 rash. And these are all symptoms that not only correspond with what the other study was seeing in Pennsylvania, but also correspond to what we would expect, the symptoms we would expect from the air pollution released from compressor stations. So if we go back to our questions, what comes out of a compressor station, and is that harmful? And in a generic sense, I hope to have at least started to answer that question. And do people living near compressor stations experience negative health effects? Well, that was really a short section, and that's because there hasn't been a lot of research done to address this question. And fracking has really exploded since the late 2000s. But the more pipelines get built, the more people become concerned, including academic researchers and physicians, the more we're learning about this topic. And so I think we're going to see more data coming in the future. So now we can get to the topic that I would really like to focus on. Could emissions from a compressor station here be harmful to human health? And as I said, there are two pollutants I would like to go into a detailed discussion about. The first is nitrogen dioxide. It's just as simple as it sounds. Nitrogen with two oxygens. And when it's concentrated, it's this brown noxious gas. It's dangerous because, of course, it's toxic to human health. And the reason is, if you look at the chemistry of this, this is actually a reactive molecule. It reacts in the atmosphere to form ozone, which high in the atmosphere is beneficial, but when it's at ground level in people, ozone is also harmful to human health. And it's produced from burning the gas in the atmosphere, because our atmosphere is actually mostly nitrogen. So, like some of the other things that we'll talk about today, this is simply a byproduct of burning fracked gas. And there's a lot of it produced by the compressor station, almost 50 tons. Now the problem is, this measurement of tons per year is something that regulatory agencies use. It really doesn't have any meaning. It's not a meaningful measurement when we talk about human health. All of health research is done using concentrations. So what is the concentration of the air pollution that people are breathing in? So somehow we have to get from this 50 tons per year to a concentration. And in the past, that's always been a roadblock for me, because even with the different training that I've had, I can't do the calculations that are required to go from tons per year to a concentration. And that's because that's a form of modeling that requires very specialized expertise. You have to take into account emission rates, you have to take into account terrain and geography, you also have to take into account local weather conditions. But what Kinder Morgan had to do for their final filing with the federal government is they had to perform that analysis. So they hired a consulting group to do that analysis. And so what we'll be able to do today is now, as of last month, we can go through and look at what Kinder Morgan is telling us to expect in terms of changes in the concentration of pollutants. And that's where nitrogen dioxide is important. So this is the results from their forecasting analysis. It's kind of forecasting the weather, doing all these calculations and models. So nitrogen dioxide, the EPA has two different ways of measuring it: an annual average, which is pretty straightforward, and this SIL, this is a significant impact level. And if the change is greater than 1, that's considered significant in some sense. So, fortunately, this annual average, according to Kinder Morgan, this wouldn't be affected. So we don't have to worry about that. But what would be affected is this 1 hour nitrogen dioxide. And what that means, the easy way to think about it is the 1 hour peak in a 24-hour period. So the 1 hour maximum. And what this analysis has done is to say, over a very long period of time, are the peaks of the pollutant going to increase? All right? So will the peak concentration change? And that's important because from everything we know about pollution, it's not just the background concentrations that are important, it's also the peaks that are important. And so that's why this measurement is included in the regulatory process. And so that threshold for calling it significant here, 7.5. And what the consultants told Kinder Morgan is, yeah, if you build that compressor station in New Ipswich and you operate it under the conditions you say you're going to operate it under, that change is going to be 13.4 micrograms per cubic meter. And that's going to be for a distance of up to 10 kilometers. So here are the real numbers that we need to try and perform some kind of initial health analysis. All right. And so the first thing we have to do is ask, what's within 10 kilometers? It's easy to figure out where the site is on something like Google Maps. And then you can start from there and figure out what's 10 kilometers out from the site they would like to use. So the site is here, this green starburst. And what I'm showing here is actually, it's not quite a Google map, this is a map from the US Census. The 2010 census, we all know, right, we calculated what's the population of the US, of New Hampshire, different counties, but actually the divisions break down a lot smaller than this. And this is a map of something called the census block group. These are data available to anybody. You just go right to the website and get this. And it turns out, just by coincidence, that this 10 kilometers from the site matches up pretty closely with this perimeter around these block groups that I've drawn up here. And I really think, if you account for this, it's going to go out a little bit more, and this won't quite fit in here. It's pretty much close to the 10 kilometers that we just saw in that projection from Kinder Morgan. So then what we can do is add up how many people live within that 10 kilometer area. And it's about 14,000 people live within 10 kilometers of the compressor station site that they would like to use. And about 3,500 of those people are children. Okay, so we have our area, we have our population. And we have our change in concentration. This is one of the most technical parts of this presentation. So ask you to bear with me. So what I've done here is I've started with this 13.4 from Kinder Morgan's report, and I've compared that to other studies, well, from public health studies that have looked at changes in this same measurement of nitrogen dioxide, this 1 hour peak concentration of nitrogen dioxide. And those studies, for convenience, they'll usually say, well, what's the change in a health outcome, like an emergency room visit for asthma, based on like a 10 microgram or a 10 part per billion change in nitrogen dioxide. So, it's easy enough. You just use some ratios and you say, well, a change of 10 units equals X change in asthma attacks. You can just use those ratios to come up with some estimates based on these public health studies. And really, these are only 4, but there are, hundreds. These are just a few of the studies. And I'm not an academic physician. I don't have time to go through and extensively and comprehensively evaluate all of the research that's been done, but it was really easy to find these. There are a lot of them. And so based on these studies, here's what I found. First of all, the way to think about this is as follows. If the concentration of nitrogen dioxide increases by 13.4, as Kinder Morgan has told us, based on this study here that I've quoted or referenced, we would expect new diagnoses of childhood asthma to increase by 7%. Okay, I'm going to go through several lines of this, but they all follow the same logic. So, a new diagnosis of a disease. It doesn't end there. That's the beginning, because once you've got a chronic disease, you need to go to the doctor who is going to help you manage your chronic disease. And this other study I referenced here, it looked at a different health outcome, clinic visits for asthma. And this study looked at all ages, but if nitrogen dioxide concentrations go up by this amount, based on what's been published, we would expect clinic visits for asthma to go up 4.4%. So, a disease like asthma, sometimes you get an asthma attack or an exacerbation. You have to go to the emergency room. And not surprisingly, if nitrogen dioxide levels go up as much as Kinder Morgan has told us, based on what's been published, I would expect emergency room visits, now here this study was looking at childhood asthma, to increase by 3.8%. Now, if you go to the emergency room, most people will get treated, they'll do better, they'll be able to go home. But some number of people who go to the emergency room have to stay in the hospital. They're too sick to go home. And of course, as one might expect, if nitrogen dioxide levels go up by this 13.4, based on the studies that have been published, just these few, hospitalizations for asthma increase 2.2%. And I'm going to bring up a couple of other things. It's not just asthma. These are just a few that I came up with. Also, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, hospitalizations for COPD up 6.7%, hospitalizations for stroke-related problems 3.7%, heart failure 6.7%. Keep in mind, this is not an exhaustive list of health conditions that are affected by nitrogen dioxide. This is a starting point. And again, if you think about all of the people who go into the hospital, most people will get treated, they will get better, they will go home. But a certain number of people who are sick enough to go to the hospital will unfortunately die. And that is the final health outcome. If we look at published studies on nitrogen dioxide, if the concentrations increase 13.4 micrograms, we would expect in that 10-kilometer area, death from cardiovascular and respiratory diseases to increase between 1.1 and 1.4%. That's why nitrogen dioxide is a closely regulated pollutant. It is toxic, there are clear health outcomes